It's with great pleasure and also by a great challenge to introduce the next speaker. Professor Gupta is a distinguished professor here at the University of Amsterdam on climate justice, sustainability, and global justice. Her research focuses not only on safe Earth boundaries, but also very much on just Earth boundaries. She's known for her tireless work on the intersection of science, policy, and also social equity. She has numerous titles. I think one of the most prestigious one is the Spinoza Prize, which is considered the Dutch Nobel Prize. On top of her research work, she does heavily engage in policymaking and is part of numerous groups, some of which being the co-chair of the Earth Commission, but also recently being the co-chair of the UN Secretary of General, appointed of 10 high-level representatives. I think one of the recent work that also is inspiring, but also just showcases her whole working style and her mentality, is her work on the global constitution, where she argues, well, the Earth needs to have some sort of or like nature needs to have some rights. And then in that work, you're engaging anyone above the age of 10, which I think we're making the cut, to submit your ideas on what a global constitution would be, just because global governance is maybe too far-fetched. So a poem, any piece of work. So not only doing excellent research, excellent policy outreach, but also engaging all of us in contributing to her work. It's just phenomenal and very inspiring.
Thank you.
Help me in welcoming Professor Gupta.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to focus on climate justice in my presentation, but I'll embed that within a larger story of sharing our world. And essentially what I'm going to talk about is the way we have really messed up our planet and how that in turn messes up the lives of humans and other inhabitants of this earth. And so basically the narrative is we need to have boundaries, standards, thresholds beyond which we should not go. I'll focus then on climate change as the key driver of all other environmental problems, and I'll talk about a just approach to addressing the problem. So essentially, if you look at our environment worldwide, the problems of the environment cause at least 25% of all death and morbidity today. That's 1/4 of all death and morbidity. 60% of all infectious disease, this is on top of that, comes from the environment. So these are diseases that are zoonotic and they move from the environmental world to the human world. And beyond that, the impacts of climate also lead to displacement and loss of income. And there is a major health challenge worldwide. Now, while most of us in this room have the privilege of having a home and water in the tap, 70% of the world's population is pretty poor. And they depend on clean air, clean water, good soils. And if you were to look at, for example, some of the urban cities of the global south, the air is so polluted, it's like smoking cigarettes. And you have lung problems, asthma, COPD. But even in the Netherlands, the last few weeks, we are hearing every day that the products we grow in our own gardens, even if we do not use pesticides, have got PFAS in them. And PFAS is also now in the blood of humans, and we don't yet know what PFAS does to our system. So basically what we have done is we have messed up the earth. And if you look at this particular figure that we published in Lancet Planetary Health some years ago, what I'm showing you from in blue to black is the impact on human health of environmental problems. And I'm showing you from green to red the impact on the environment. So a lot of people sort of think that, environment is a left-wing subject, has nothing to do with the right-wing governments. But actually, that's crazy because the environment is everybody's environment. It's true that rich people probably live in houses that are air-conditioned and they can better cope than poorer people, but essentially all of us breathe the same air. And in this particular graph, we were trying to find out what is the most serious problem. And probably it is air pollution, including climate change, which is not only in itself serious, but it has huge impacts on humans. But of course, we are in the 6th biodiversity extinction event, so that also has impacts. But something people aren't well aware of is land degradation. The land and the soil is so badly destroyed worldwide that 3.2 billion people, and this is before the PFAS news came out in the Netherlands, 3.2 billion people in the world are affected by the lower and lower productivity of their soils. Okay, so then the question is, who is causing all this air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, ocean pollution? Who is exhausting these resources? And essentially what you see here is on the left, privileged, and on the right, marginalized people. And then on the y-axis, you see the contribution to the drivers and pressures of the problem. Now, if you look at the data, essentially it is the super rich people that cause the biggest problems on the earth. And it's not that they have more breakfast or lunch than you, but it's the items on the plate that they eat that travel much further away, or it is the money that they have in their pension funds or in their investments that cause a lot of the problems. So in terms of the damage to the earth, it is definitely the richer people who cause more damage. But in terms of who suffers, and I'm now talking existentially, the chance that you lose your life, that your health is damaged, that is primarily the more marginalized, the low-income countries who are losing 5% of their GDP currently to climate change impacts, and the number of people that die from household air pollution, mostly the poorer people. And what you're finding, therefore, is that there is a discrepancy between those who cause the problem and those who get affected. And this is primarily the problem that we cannot now come together in politics to decide to take action. Because essentially what I'm showing you is that the rich people have to take action, but they're the ones who are powerful. And so why should they take action to reduce their own impact? And they are increasingly indifferent to the poorer people in their own countries. And I'm not just talking about the developing world, I'm also talking about the rich world, because the huge inequalities in the global north. Now, I don't know how familiar you all are to the concept of drivers, pressure, state, impact, and response. This is the model used by UNEP and the European Environment Agency to analyze problems. But when they do that, they don't take equity issues into account most of the time. So what we did is we prepared this document where we said, how do drivers result from, mitigate, or exacerbate inequalities? Who uses and pollutes resources and things, not just what causes the problem? How is exposure to benefits and risk distributed? How are impacts distributed? Who is able to adapt? Who pays for residual damages? And how do responses redistribute rights, risks, and responsibilities? So what we're trying to do here is to understand who is causing the problem and ultimately who is paying for the problem. And if you talk, for example, to a lot of businessmen, they will tell you that they are under a lot of pressure from their CEOs and the shareholders to get more and more profits. And a lot of this means that they're externalizing their social and environmental costs on others. So they make the profits, we bear the risks. All right. So let me look at justice. And this is a really complicated story, because when I started working on climate change 35 years ago, and I wanted to talk about justice, I was advised by my professors and guides, justice is too normative. Try and go for empirical facts and, don't sort of frame it like that. So I didn't. I focused on the north-south issues, the rich-poor issues, but I didn't really use the words of justice all the time. Today, the word justice has sort of become more acceptable. And in our Nature paper, together with Lenton, we published Nature 2 years ago, and there the editorial of Nature talked about how important justice has become to science. So that's a sort of a coming of age of justice. So what we did was, in justice, we looked at all the literature, local to global. So anthropologists and sociologists look mostly local. International lawyers look mostly at the global level. And then we looked at conservative justice versus transformative justice. So if you take a country with a very unequal distribution of land, and you want to redistribute the land, very often the big landowners will say, you can have the land, but you have to pay me. So it's very expensive for the government to pay those rich guys to get the land for other people, or pay those rich guys to get the water to pay for others. And that's conservative justice. Transformative justice is trying to see how can we make the world a better place. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, what we discovered is that if you stay on the conservative side of justice, rich people will become richer and richer. And you will not solve the global trade problems and the tariff problems and investment problems and contract problems that are international. So you need to be on the right side, and you need to have an iterative process from local to global. And very simply, this is our model. So as I was telling you earlier, if you talk to business, they'll talk about their CEO and they'll talk about the shareholders. What about the stakeholders? What about those who are impacted? And that brings us to the idea of recognition justice. Recognition justice looks at the world from the perspective of the other. Epistemic justice looks at science not only from the way we do it, but from the way other people do it in the world. And then you have ideal justice, which I explained from the previous slide. Then we go one step further and we say we'll talk about interspecies justice and earth system stability, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. And then, of course, there's process. Process means you all should be able to participate in decision making. You should get access to information. You should be able to protest on the streets, and you should be able to go to court to fight for justice. That's process. And then you have substance. And essentially, substance is about how do we allocate the rights and responsibilities? How do we allocate the resources of this earth? So when we operationalize this conceptualization, in the first phase of the Earth Commission, we focused on ends and means. And we took two ends. The first end is that there must be boundaries beyond which we should not go. Some of you might know the term standards: ambient air quality standards, water quality standards, soil quality standards. So these are standards, but you can also have boundaries or thresholds beyond which you should not go. And that's based on not causing harm to others. So that's the principle of interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational justice. And by putting not causing harm to others, you're also recognizing others, you're using their knowledge. Then the second one is, given that the Sustainable Development Goals require us to meet the basic needs of people worldwide, how are we going to do that? And what is the impact of that on the boundary? So this is going beyond Kate Raworth's work. And what we're trying to do is calculate the impact of meeting minimum needs in the same units as the boundary. And then we have means. And the first one is, how do we address the drivers of both the environmental problem, but also of inequality, because both are related problems? Can we allocate liability for causing harm? How do we allocate remaining resources equitably and responsibility? So this is, in very brief, a summary of our systemic justice approach, or earth system justice. So to put it slightly differently, Johan Rockström wrote a paper in 2009 with colleagues on planetary boundaries. You may be familiar with that work. Our story is, are those planetary boundaries also just? Because those boundaries are based on the idea that beyond a certain level, there's a tipping point and then the system begins to collapse. Or you create a large number of irreversible changes. The second question is, can we meet minimum needs of everybody within the boundaries? And how do we allocate the remaining resources? All right. So this is the results that we published in our Nature paper. And the red line shows you the safe boundaries. We have here 5 domains. It doesn't cover all the domains. We have climate, air pollution, biodiversity, water, and nutrients. And there are some different indicators for this. So what happened was, in this process, we were a group of 60 people or so, and essentially our scholars came up with safe numbers. And that is shown in this. So climate change, for example, gets the safe number of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. But is this just? So from a justice perspective, we had 10 criteria. The boundary needs to minimize harm. It shouldn't just be quantity, it should also have a qualitative component. It should account for context like slopes or climate or water flows. It should be translated locally if it's a global number or a regional number. It should be assessed spatially, be mapped. It should be linked to poverty analysis as a proxy for vulnerability. And we should look at who is causing the problem. This should be then debated and adopted locally and globally. So it's not like we are prescribing this number. And finally, it has to be achieved in a just manner. So then we started debating about climate change. And my professor, a long time ago, Pierre Wellinkar, wrote with a few other colleagues a paper once, pre-1990, that up to 1 degree, it is green. Beyond 1 to 2, it is orange, meaning some people in some areas of the world are badly harmed. And beyond 2 degrees, everybody is harmed. So that paper was there before 1990. So I went back and I said, I think I want to go back to 1 degree. Let's look at it. And I couldn't get data, because IPCC's work was more from 2 degrees onwards. In fact, IPCC only did the 1.5 degree report in 2018, which is a long time later. And so finally, we were trying to reconstruct the whole story. And then eventually we found data on wet bulb temperatures, which is the yellow line at the bottom. And that showed you that already at 1 degree centigrade, tens of millions of people, so roughly about 70 million people, are exposed to death because you cross very high temperatures and very high humidity, which means your body can't sweat. And if your body can't sweat, then you are very close to to sickness and to maybe fatal moments. So that is about 1% of the global population. If on top of that, you add the people who are falling sick from malaria or falling sick because of extreme weather events, it's roughly around 1% of the world's population that's happened. That's a huge number. And during the entire process of the climate negotiations, and I'm really angry about this, although international law says you cannot cause harm to other countries, you can do what you like in your own country, but you cannot cause harm to other countries. Although this was adopted in 1992 in the Rio Declaration, the Climate Convention did not. This is rich people supporting themselves. So basically, then we came up with the 1 degree target, and we haven't been that sophisticated, but in terms of really going through all the numbers, because it's a lot of work to get a simple number like 1. But we found that nitrogen and the aerosol boundary also has to be tightened. And now we are investigating the ground and safe water to see whether that also has a different story. But essentially, this is what we have been trying to do. Now, where are we in relation to the boundaries? So this graph shows you that all the boundaries have been crossed at global level, except the air pollution one, because the aerosol boundary at the global level is about a change in hemispheric aerosol pollution, which leads to a change in monsoon patterns. And that is different from the local air pollution patterns, which causes your breathing problems. So we linked that with the local ones, and that's how we tightened it. Now, where is it happening? Well, more than half the world has crossed more than 2 boundaries, affecting 86% of the global population. And you can see that parts of Central Europe and Europe actually, and Asia, they're not doing that well. They're crossing most of the boundaries, which is quite a serious issue. So we have boundaries proposed. We have crossed most of them, which means we have to come back into those boundaries, which means we have to reduce our consumption and our pollution of the earth. Second question, can we meet the basic needs of people within these boundaries? So we just took 4 indicators. We took food, water, energy, and infrastructure. And remember that you need energy also for food. You need energy for water. You need energy for a little house. So we're really talking 3 bulbs in a refrigerator plus the energy for the rest. A house the size of a parking lot per person. So really very, very little to help people escape from poverty. And then we had 2 levels of very minimum dignity and escape from poverty. And we started modestly because the SDGs were talking about $1.25 per person, or very low numbers, And so we thought, can you really buy food, water, energy with that money per day? And so we said, we're not going to look at the money side, we're going to look at the access side. Okay, and then what we did was we looked at what does this access mean in terms of impacts on climate change, biodiversity loss, water, land use, etc. And so these are our results. So over here, what you see in blue is the impacts in 2018, a pre-COVID year. Now, these are the impacts of all of us, all right? And it starts at 90%, to 0 to 90% is outside this slide. Now, if you give the poorest people in the world a little bit, then you get the orange impact. If you help them sort of escape from poverty, or at least give them the chance to escape from poverty, you get the pink lot. And basically, it amounts to around 26% of extra greenhouse gas emissions in 2018 if you were to do that using existing systems. So let me link it back with my justice narrative. So we have ends and means. So we're talking about boundaries. That's the blue line. We're talking about minimum needs. I'll come and explain the dotted line in a minute. And then we're talking about the means to get to that space. That's the challenge. Since we were outside the boundary, so I'll show that in the next slide. Since we are outside the boundary, we are already in overshoot, all of us. Now, if you meet the minimum needs, you go into potential overshoot. And this means that how the hell do we get the whole world into that safe space? And we debated a lot within the Earth Commission, and the scenario we chose was that everybody, you and I too, all of us get 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, the house the size of a parking lot, etc. Okay, and then only there's a bit of space left, and that's your green corridor for sharing with the billionaires and millionaires of this world, and also the rest of the world. So this is quite a tough issue. And right now we are calculating what does it mean if you have clothes, and clothes are unbelievably polluting, and just whether it's cotton or polyester or silk or wool, they all have their footprints. And then you're going to look at technology, access to a telephone or something, because otherwise poor people can't sell their goods and commodities, access to primary healthcare and primary schooling. So we're going to add those 4. So the corridor is going to shrink further. But what are our results? This came out in the Lancet Planetary Health Earth Commission report. And what you see on the left side is 2018. So then you can really assume technology as a constant. And what we found was that if you take climate change, that if you give people the minimum, all of us, you and me too, everybody, then there's a small green space to share the remaining emission space. If you go to 2050, and we were quite conservative in our understanding of how technology will develop, which today seems quite accurate because of the backfall in our phasing out of fossil fuel, then there is no corridor. Everybody has 3 bulbs in a refrigerator, there is no corridor, right? So this is a very big challenge that we all face. And the question, of course, is what do we do next? Now, I'm sure that Tim probably showed you this slide, because this is also from our Lancet paper. And here he's shown you the global tipping points and the regional tipping points. And then we have maps in the Lancet paper where we map out the spatial distribution of biodiversity targets. In this particular case, we're looking at the target of 20 to 25% green in every square kilometer of land. And the more blue it is, the more this exists. And the more yellow it is, the less that this spatial distribution of green exists. Even in a rich country like the Netherlands, we find it is the rich people who have a lot of good green, and the poorer people are pushed together in neighborhoods where they don't have that much green. So that was one of the targets we had. And then we tried to map this in relation to vulnerability and poverty, and we tried to do all kinds of other stuff. And then we came with 3 major conclusions about the need for economic and political change, better management, and investment in better technologies. I could spend some time there, but I'm going to keep that short. And we now have a pop-up museum moving through Amsterdam. You might want to visit it if you like. And this is telling you it's taking you through the journey of the safe and just boundaries. Okay, let me now focus on climate change. So if on the x-axis you have time and on the y-axis you have emissions, we knew quite early on that we have to get our emissions to 0. So that meant that in 1990, when the negotiations started, it was a pretty big cake of emissions that we could share with each other. And as we move towards 2030 and 2050, the cake is shrinking. If you want to stabilize at 1.5 or 2 or even 1. And that means that every year we are going to fight with each other about who has the right to emit. And we are going to fight inside countries with each other about who has the right to it. And that's also why you're seeing that some of the larger countries, including the Netherlands, has decided to not really focus so much on mitigation. And this is going to be a major problem. Now, we are not following this route. And as a consequence, there are major impacts worldwide. And this is why there's a call for justice. And we have all these social movements protesting, but we also have around 2,200 court cases right now with about quite a few against the fossil companies. And these court cases are trying to look for justice because the legislature and the executive has failed them. Okay, so let me look at the North-South issue. In 1990, some of you are economists, you may be familiar with the environment Kuznets curve. It's an inverted U curve, and it basically means that as countries become richer, they will pollute more. And after a while, they're so rich, they want to have a clean environment, they want to have clean water. So they will invest themselves to improve the environment. And rich countries thought that they could decouple their emissions from their economic growth and that they would have the technologies to give developing countries. We now know that that curve doesn't exist. It's actually an N-shaped curve. And that means that as people get richer, each child and each room in the house has to have technology. And they go for bigger and bigger houses. And we find that there is no time for them to keep getting richer. They have to get to zero if we want 1.5 or even 2. Developing countries have to get to zero too. They cannot afford to go all the way up and then come down because they will get locked into a fossil economy. Now, so this is bad news for both rich and poor countries. Rich countries because they want to give their old technologies to the global south, and poor countries because they think, hey, but I would like to be rich before I become more modest in my use. And that's a problem. And the other problem that there is that the later you peak your environmental emissions, the more drastically you have to reduce. And this is a major problem in the Netherlands and every other developed country because we kept postponing the actions to the future. Because why should politicians take risks? So this is a slightly older picture, but it basically shows you similar data similar to today. Most per capita CO2 emissions come from the global north. If you look at who is affected, most people in the global south are more affected, as shown in the dark red colors. Okay, I'm now going to discuss 6 cumulative injustices. Injustice 1. We knew pre-1990 that up to 1 it is green, from 1 to 2 it is orange, from 2 it is red. And nevertheless, we waited for 25 years till 2015 to adopt the long-term quantified target in the Paris Agreement. And that allowed rich countries to continue to use fossil fuel. And this also gave a bad message to developing countries because basically it said, hey, it's not a serious problem, we can all use fossil fuel. Second, sharing the cake. So if we knew in 1990 what the cake was, we could have done certain criteria, maybe historical, maybe not, but we could have done certain criteria for allocating emission rights to countries. Now, we waited till 2015, so the cake had become so small that it's impossible to divide it amongst the countries. And so what did they say? They said, okay, everybody do what you can. So that is why we were moving towards a 2.7 to 3 degree world right now, if you add the voluntary contributions of all these countries. Now, this all assumes that there is a fixed cake, and once you eat the cake, there's no cake left. But that's not true, because today, 80% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the developing world. If you deduct some of the rich countries and the OPEC countries, it's still around 50% in Africa, for example, or in the poorer countries of the global south. Right? So they are now saying we will use our fair share, but we never left a fair share for them. So if they use their fair share, we go way beyond the 2.7 degrees centigrade. Moreover, the whole fossil industry is worth between 16 trillion and 295 trillion US dollars, which is either 1/5 of global GDP or about 3 times global GDP. And so what basically this means is that those guys are so unbelievably rich and powerful that they are also controlling not only governments, but also universities. There's a recent paper that shows how they finance universities, and universities become addicted to the flow of resources from fossil companies. So that's the issue of stranded resources and stranded assets. Next, mitigation instruments. When I was very young, about your age, I remember that rich countries started saying, but reducing emissions in a rich country is expensive. So let's do it cheap. Let's do it in Latvia or somewhere else far away in the global south. Then you offset. So you are very rich, you do what you want, and then you just give a check and you get some reduction somewhere else in the world, and you put that reduction on your side of the balance sheet. I remember writing a book in 1996 with Shakespeare Maya from Zimbabwe, where we talked about the fact that if you do this, you do not change your society structurally. You just export, you offset your behavior. So today, what you find in most rich countries is that they have not educated the public. They have not told people above the age of 25 who didn't study climate in school or college what kind of changes or what environmental problems are. And yesterday I was at Klingendahl and I was discussing with Indonesian diplomats, and they told me that even in Indonesia, the elder diplomats are less informed about these issues than the younger ones. So if you don't educate the elder people, they won't know, and they'll say, oh, this is a left-wing topic, and they won't do anything on the subject. So there's an age difference too. And this is also because we were so efficient with our reduction. Then we come to the damages. World Economic Forum said a few years ago that it's $15 million per hour. The European Union says it's much more because their recent impacts in Europe are very, very high. And finally, what causes this problem? This is caused primarily because companies want to make profit, governments want to get richer, and why should you bother about social and environmental limitations when that stands in the way of your GDP and your profits? And hey, what? If you fall sick and you go to hospital, our GDP goes up. And that is also a way you think. And for poorer people, they don't go to hospital, so we don't note that they're dead. So that's a really big problem that we are seeing nowadays. So those were my justice issues. Right now, Yang, a colleague of mine, is busy trying to quantify some of these things. And for example, he concludes that from a per capita perspective, the rich countries emitted 6 times as much as poor countries between 1990 and 2015. He shows that, for example, rich countries have 8 times more pipeline length per person than poorer countries, but poorer countries now want to do pipes for their fossil fuel dependency. So I think we in the global north, we have to help them get off the energy fixation on fossil fuel. We have to help them with the transition, because if we don't help them, we suffer. It's in our own self-interest. And even if it is not in the self-interest of a grandmother or a grandfather, it is in the interest of their grandkids. So that's why it's so important. And then, of course, if you look at the subsidies weighted by population, rich countries gave more than twice the fossil fuel related subsidies than the others. So you're finding that, in fact, in all this period, there's been double speak. Yang, my colleague, also made this map where he's showing you all the coal mines in the world. If the mine is white in color, it has a short life for 5 more years, 10 more years. And that is very useful for rich countries because they are hoping that they will wind off all of these fossil fuels in the next so many years. But if you look at India and China and Southeast Asia, South Asia, it's dark red. They're new mines. How do you close them down? Because you've taken a loan probably with a planning of 30 years or 50 years or 80 years. You have to pay back the loan. How the hell will you close it down tomorrow or the after? It's not possible. And so many people work there. And I didn't bring the slide, but if you look at who is investing in fossil fuel in the global south, a lot of it is us. So it is our shareholders that invest them. It is our governments that give export credit, which is a subsidy to our companies to invest there in fossil fuel. And even though that is officially so-called being stopped, there's so many loopholes. All right. This is a slide I did with Arthur Rempel, a PhD that I used to have. And we're looking at the supply side measures to reduce fossil fuel. And basically, we looked at all the measures that exist. And the most important message in this particular publication is that feasible instruments are economic instruments. They're efficient instruments like market mechanisms. And so governments have gone whole scale for market mechanisms, but they did not look at what is effective, what is legitimate, what is just. So essentially, you're getting, a policy process needs to have a balanced set of instruments to deal with a problem. But if you just take one because it's politically feasible, you have a problem. And this political feasibility story is linked to the fact that since 1990, we've been going into deregulation. And deregulation means that there's less and less standards and thresholds and requirements. Like if you use shampoo on your hair, it should be tested for when you have washed it off and it comes into the water stream, right? And that's not really happening for most of the products we use on our face or our hair, on our body, on our clothes, etc. And so what is happening is the water is getting completely polluted. Okay, maybe a minute on emissions trading. It's a market mechanism. So since I'm beating up the market mechanisms, let me have some fun here. So you have, for emissions trading, you need to know how much the total is. And you need to divide it amongst countries. And then you need to make sure that countries can trade, and this is efficient. So early on, what happened was that we didn't have a total budget till 2015. So you can't divide it. Now, if you are going to divide it, you can divide it per capita or through grandfathering. So if you do it per capita, you basically get 150 countries of the global south getting a large size of the cake because they have most of the people also. And the rich countries get a small size of the carbon cake or carbon budget. This means that rich countries have to pay poor countries for the right to develop, right? Of course, rich countries didn't agree. This is pre-1990. And then there's another alternative, grandfathering. And grandfathering basically means that if your granddad had a house, you own the house. And if your neighbor, her or his grandfather doesn't have a house, you don't get a house, right? So the property rights goes down from generations. And this principle also exists in historical rights to water. But basically what happens over here is if I squat on the atmosphere with my pollution, I become the owner of the rights. You follow? And then the poorer countries have to pay the rich countries to buy the right to pollute. All right? Obviously, poor countries said no to this in the 1990s. And so the compromise in 1997 in the Kyoto Protocol is, all right, poor countries, you can keep expanding. Rich countries will reduce their emissions by 5.2%, but they can do that by writing checks to the poorer countries for products that they do there. So theoretically, rich countries' emissions can go up as long as they write enough checks and get enough reductions in the other countries. So this was a really big problem, and it was very strange because I presented this in the Swedish parliament because the parliament was wondering why the NGOs are so pissed off with this. So they asked me to explain it, and that's how I did it. And this is what the NGOs produced in 2000 at The Hague. This is a currency note, and it says the history of colonialism goes in parallel with the creation of new commodities: slavery, sugar, tea, coffee, oil, carbon. So this is also the way in which our markets work. And anyway, I've already shown you this number, $16 million per hour as damage. But the biggest problem is when you're sitting with policymakers, they don't understand what that elephant is about. You know, someone's felt the leg, someone's felt the ear, but they have no idea that messing with your environment is such an unbelievably complicated issue and so irreversible. And then let's talk a little bit about oil and gas companies. This is a recent paper that came out this year. They knew in 1950 that there was a problem because the problem was already almost 2 centuries old. Climate change was discovered by Eunice Newton-Foote in 1856, a woman, by the way. So you have to Google for who is the mother, then you'll find it. If you just say who discovered, you'll find the man. And one day it will change, but right now it's different. All right, for denial. So first what they did is they said, oh, this is all nonsense. They don't know what they're talking about. So casting doubt. Then they began to question the science and say, oh, but don't forget about the ice ages and so on. Then they started to lobby very effectively in the parliaments here as well as in America. And then they started to do revolving door where CEOs of oil and gas companies joined the European Union and EU professionals joined the oil and gas companies. Then after a while, they started to go into delay. And then they keep saying, we are necessary. You need us. We can't help it, but you need us. And that's necessitarianism, that it's inevitable that fossil fuel will have to have. It's inevitable that gas will be the transition fuel. And if you look at the language in their reports, they make it sound like it's solid science. And that it's, like the cause of harm is not mentioned anywhere. And then they talk about greenwashing, don't worry, we are spending money on renewables. Or they say, don't worry, we'll do carbon capture and storage, which I don't think they can afford in most cases. It's very, very expensive. And how will they have the resources at the end? And then strategic blame placement. Sometimes if you listen very carefully, they'll be saying, the problem is the consumer. He wants to drive. We're just helping them. Or they want to fly. We're just helping them. So that's how the narrative is framed. Of course, in many countries and many places, many companies, they're trying to put some kind of restrictions on the use of oil and gas. And you can make a long list of this. This is slightly old, but I know that a number of companies that promised to do something are reversing the promise now. And there are two reasons for reversal. The first reason is many of them are spending money on AI, and AI uses unbelievable amounts of energy and water and resources. So it's difficult for them to meet that within their targets. And the other reason is because there is a sort of shift right now globally back to fossil. And you know what I'm talking about. All right. So there are four tragedies. The first tragedy is households, governments say, I'm so small, my emissions don't matter. And I think every emission counts, and that's why it's important to think about it. The second one are the large companies, and they say, are people who say, I'm spending my money well, but they earn from fossil. So Amsterdam has a donut economy, and there's a lot of PR about how well we spend our money in Amsterdam, but where do we earn it? We have a lot of money in the port of Amsterdam with fossil, and we have shares in Schiphol, which is all fossil-based. So there is a discrepancy, and you'll see that discrepancy also with many philanthropies. Then you have the countries and companies that say, I'm so large, I can't do this without, being voted out of power or whatever. And those are the countries that actually have this strategic mass for change. And then the last one is, why should I take action if nobody else is? So many companies tell me, yeah, but no one else is doing anything. Why should I do something? SMEs in the Netherlands are not doing that much, and they claim that they are very poor. So this basically means that big companies should do scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions to make sure that all the SMEs that feed into their cycle are able to actually take action. I'm now coming to the last part of my presentation. Basically, if you look at land and water, it's more or less fixed, but it's getting degraded. So the supply is going down, but demand is going up. And if you look at minerals and metals that are strategic, again, the supply is going down, but the demand is going up. And with fossil fuel, we have a lot of fossil fuel, but we should leave it underground. So basically what we're talking about is a sort of scarcity at the global level. Now, when you have scarcity, some people will talk in terms of the rational actor model, and others will talk in terms of the social practice model. The rational actor model for economists could be that we need to price these scarce commodities properly, and then the market will allocate this fairly. Now, this is a problem if you're going to do it with water, for example, because then the price of water will go up so much that it will be used for biofuels and champagne, but not for grains and for just sitting in the canal outside. So there is a problem with this. And of course, when you spend a lot of money in commodifying nature, you do it with a contract, and you get a good lawyer, and it is so difficult to change or reverse. Then you have hegemonic power. Hegemonic power is about my country first. And in water law, you will see that upstream countries are very reluctant to share the water with downstream countries. And that has been the predominant way in which water has been dealt with in the past. But now increasingly, you will see that in the global mood today, there's a lot of my country first narrative. And that doesn't help to solve the problem, because you basically say, I'll do what I like within my country, and I don't care about the damage abroad, because I get better benefits and the costs are externalized. Then you have polycentricity, sort of an idea that emerges from Elinor Ostrom's work. And there she talks about multiple centers of governance and self-management and experimentation. I think that this was quite valid in the time that she lived. But today, since we have crossed the boundaries, small little groups deciding will not help to share the problem and decide equally. So I'm going towards what is called the social practice model. It's been there in politics for a very long time. It's really about how do we live as a society? How are we solidar with each other? Even you might say the birth of the UN in 1945 is a sort of a sign of a social practice model. So basically, what I'm trying to work now, because the climate story is getting quite frustrating with the lack of action worldwide. So I thought it's not just climate, it's biodiversity loss, it's land degradation, it's health problems. Why don't we work on something that is bigger, a global constitution? So last year, 2 years ago, I got €1.5 million from the Dutch government, the Spinoza Prize. And what we're doing is we're using that with our PhDs to work towards a global constitution. But the mood in the world right now is not such that the UN is going to be open to such an idea, I think. So what we decided is turn it around. Let's see if we can 500 contributing authors. Maybe we can get 50,000 contributing authors, and they can write pieces, they can write poems, they can write paintings or photographs that symbolize their ideas about the future, the world they want to live in. You could write as a microbe, you could write as the fish, you could write as the climate system, you could write as yourself. I have young children who write with the support of their parents, and I have mothers of twins. So I have different kinds of people writing right now for us. So I would like to invite all of you to join this project. It's just globalconstitution.org, all small letters, no space. And we hope that you will all join and you can share it with anybody you like. We also have a moving pop-up museum moving right now through Amsterdam. And we're inviting the general public. This is the second time. And people put their ideas there, and all those ideas are taken on board and worked on. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. And I just want to thank my colleagues of the ERC Advanced Grant and the Global Constitution Project and the Earth Commission for the entire amount of data and information that has been part of this presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. Super interesting and energizing. Really like it. I think we have time for some questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this. When you refer to one of the issues with human rights is that it's normative, but it's normative as mapping on the space. Basically, you create a human right, you have to define it. And
it's normative.
And don't define it, we assume that it doesn't exist as a little bit of an issue. Some people working on a comparable system, or like I talked to my notion of what to do. One idea is the idea of human dignity in the comparable system. Do you think it's possible that instead of going on the normative drafting of an element of a law, you can just try to embed the principle into what is already there? Like when you run any sort of social action, any sort of public administration action against a principle, you can get a hit. Yes, no, it fits, it doesn't fit. And human dignity is such very much what you're referring to.
Actually, human rights are based on the concept, at least the ones for food, water, energy, are based on the concept of human dignity, but it is less, I think, than escape from poverty. So what has happened in this particular project is we quantified it. So in the human right to water and sanitation that was adopted in 2010, there's a lot of discussion about how to quantify that. And so the UN is thinking about different quantifications of the human right to water. How many minutes should it take you to get the water? How long should it take you to get to a toilet? They have all these different notions, which there's a quantification. So what you're seeing, at least on the human right to water and sanitation, is there is a massive movement to try to do that. The problem, of course, is if you live in a slum, how do I put a toilet in a house that is not recognized? If I put a toilet and I make a connection, I'm saying, okay, that house is okay, that's recognized, come and squat. So this is the problem which governments are facing right now on the squatting issue, and we need to find a solution for that. Maybe we have to say, okay, these people have to live somewhere, or we have to create public toilets that are available free of cost for these people, but it has to be financed. And that is why you need the money from somewhere else. But I think the point that you're making about linking human rights to dignity, I would go one step further. The normative notion is human rights. you expand it based on access to food, water, energy, infrastructure, education, healthcare, maybe communication. So you expand that and then you quantify that, which is what we are doing in the Earth Commission. And after you quantify that, you try to see, is what is happening in different countries in line with this? So that's how we are trying to deal with it. We're trying to make it empirical.
Yeah.
What my question is, and I think I am. Thank you so much. This was brilliant. And I know that you talked a lot about between country inequalities and within country inequalities and emissions and who is responsible. And I think the growing evidence shows that within country inequalities and emissions is getting more important maybe, but please tell me what your opinion is, than between countries because of the rich people, because of inequalities in that. And also, but what we have still kind of like networks of like solution is like comparison parties or in the US, and we still kind of think in terms of being country emissions and the carbon market is also in countries. But obviously, I think that is still valuable because there is still a lot of historical inequalities, etc. But and then your project is also global institutions. I guess that's also. So I'm trying to ask for kind of what level is
all the way through. So it's all the way through. And I'll go back and tell you that when I was showing you my justice framework, there was one element which was address the drivers of the problem, say biodiversity loss or climate, and inequality, because inequality is created by our tax system or it's created by our policies. So an inequality is a separate social problem. And when you layer it on top of environmental inequality, you get exacerbated inequality. So you have to address both. So that is how we dealt with it. And you have to do it from local to global. So let me give you an example and linking up with the previous speaker. If I have schools free for children, but they don't have clothes, it's difficult for the girls to go to school. And if there is no toilet in the school, the teachers also won't come to the school. And the girls, again, will not go. Boys might go, but the girls won't go because during their periods, they need a toilet. So you see that there is a link between access to all. And if you have schools, but there is no food at home, your brain is not functioning. Why some schools also give midday meals to these children. So, you know, you have to give it as a package, because if you don't have that package, then it's very difficult for you to escape from poverty. Okay. And moreover, suppose one of the people in the family gets sick, heart attack, blood pressure, whatever, cancer, asthma, you have to go to the hospital. And if you don't have the money for primary health care, then again, you slip back. And during COVID, the poorest people who had escaped from poverty slipped back into poverty as a consequence. So essentially, you have to look at the link between environmental pollution and inequality, which is why we right now have one PhD who's focusing on these two particular issues. And it's also coming from the public, like from you, with that, how do we do this better? It has to be multi-level. And in my justice slide, I said from local to global, local to global. It's multiple iterations, because if you don't do that, you don't get to a solution. And true, the constitution is meant to be an ideal constitution. So that's also one of the benefits when you do it with everybody, that you're not biting off little bits based on what is feasible. You're doing something that you think this is what we need. And of course, there's a strong normative element there. And yeah, and of course, it's not based on the normative element that the market should decide everything. Yeah, I think.
Thank you so much. So I'm from the States, and I've been watching as we've been maybe shifting from, you're talking about the neoliberal model, I'm thinking about defunding USAID, which is this classic kind of market-based solution, or moving towards hegemonic, just taking whatever we can. And I'm curious about I love what you're talking about, basically making people realize that it's beneficial for the rich countries to help the poor countries not with fossil fuels. And I'm curious about how you think that mental model shift happens in the rich countries, as we're seeing sort of the mental models degrading towards antisocial behaviors. Basically, what would it take for the people in my country, or the richest people, to see there would need to be a different set of assumptions, and how does that connect to maybe the bigger changes?
So I think I would say there are 3 points that I have in mind. And the first point is what I already mentioned earlier. I see a massive intergenerational gap between young people who went to school and college and between the rest. And the rest are not well informed. There are, of course, a few people who are, but most of the public is relatively poorly informed about pesticide use on their tomatoes and plastics every day in the shops and all that. So the problem is that the older generation, which is much more 60 to 90 in terms of the years, is less willing to take action. That's a generational issue. The second point I want to make is a democracy issue. For a functioning democracy, you need people who have escaped from poverty, because they need to be able to have a job, etc., to be able to then think, who should I elect? And they will then have the breathing space to participate in a democracy. But also, if you have superbly rich people on the other end, they can buy democracies. They can influence elections. And you are seeing that also. And they create a massive problem. So from a democratic perspective, if you truly believe in democracy, we really have to try to see what is the maximum inequality that is possible in a society to be able to sustain a functioning democracy and all its diverse organs. I mean, not just the US aid, but also the legislature and the executive and the ministries and all of those who are also being hollowed out right now in the United States. And then the third point I have is a very simple point. If I drive a car and I hit somebody, I'm held accountable. But if I drive a car and because of that, somebody else far away gets hurt, I'm not held accountable. I think the way to catch the super polluters is to catch them on harm, the harm that they caused. And maybe we should focus primarily on the big companies to see how we can get, because they have discussed it. An individual may not have had so much knowledge, but a big company should have had the knowledge. So my gut feeling is the no harm principle is what we need to use. We need to go to court. We need to get that organized. And tax justice, and no harm goes with tax justice.
I was just going to ask about when you think about the safe, just earth boundaries, and the difference between things that are common, so for instance, like infrastructure, and then things that individuals own. Are you thinking about like difference in needs and like does that come into it, or are you just thinking about it as from an individual perspective?
If I understood you correctly, so for us, the commons are from local to global. So if you have a small water lake somewhere, it could be a local commons, but it can go all the way. It is nested within the global system, the multi-level systems of water commons, right? And water, of course, it evaporates, it goes downwards, but it goes upwards through capillary motion. So the water has a very fluid story. So basically, the idea is to have boundaries and standards for that. So you could have a boundary to the amount of water you take from a river or the amount of water you take from your groundwater, but you could also have standards for this is where you swim, so that's the quality, this is where the dolphin swims, this is the quality. But the second part is needs. Yeah. And that's slightly different because there you're looking at, if I give you the needs, what is your impact on the boundary? You could also turn it around in a different way. For our particular purpose, we were working with the safe and just boundaries on the floor. So for that purpose, we did it like this. But essentially, if you cross the boundaries, you also affect people's needs.
I think I'm asking a bit more technically, like how do you think about, so for instance, if you're running a refrigerator, you need to run an energy grid or some kind of like thing. How do you think about do you distinct between those when you're thinking about what is the boundary, what's the just boundary?
No. No. It is the boundary for the boundary in total is based on the total amount of energy you can use to cause problems to the earth. But when we give your basic needs, we're just saying 3 bulbs a refrigerator or the equivalent energy. So we are not saying you can have a hell of a lot more energy in that system. So we are not, our technology is an average technology used in the world to achieve certain goals. That's how we calculate the impacts. But it's not like we're going to every household and looking at how their refrigerator, yeah, it's not like that.
All right.
Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is regarding the capabilities of approach of this response. How do you think that taking into consideration the capabilities approach in the climate justice might shift the focus from reducing emissions communities and focusing on people's freedom and ability to adapt? And how can this also impact global climate policies, especially for financing initiatives?
So the idea with the capabilities approach is somewhat implicit in our escape from poverty. The idea is if you can escape from poverty, you have some freedom to choose. So for the very, very poorest people, the idea is that we want to give them more space to do the things they want to do. But we are in some way saying that if you are super rich, for example, because where do I get that space from? Because you have to be within the boundary. So the question, and why you have to be within the boundary? Because otherwise everybody loses. So the story is that even if you're very rich, there's a limit beyond which you cannot have a footprint. So there's a maximum footprint beyond which you can't emit because you have to make space for everybody else. So that's the narrative. It's not, and in the capability approach, unfortunately or fortunately, Sen did not really explore the environmental aspects of his narrative. So we try to do that because we are linking his escape from poverty to what does it mean for the environment. One of the big questions we get all the time is what about population growth? And then I have to sort of explain the whole history and knowledge of population growth to people. But this is often used by a lot of people to undermine the fact that a lot of this is also, our work is also based on this notion of that if there are more people in the future, there will be more impact when you meet minimum needs. I don't know whether
Thank you. Just for a follow-up question regarding the financing. So for the investors, for example, how can they take into consideration the climate justice with prioritizing where they should shift the capital? Because the issue is the definition of what contributes an activity or which companies we need to invest in or which companies we need to divest from, usually focuses solely on the reduction of emissions and absolute, without necessarily taking into consideration the climate justice or the community.
they don't even do the first part. If you look at the investors, you look at the pension funds, the banks, and you look across the world, you might see a little bit more in the developed countries that they're being a little bit more conscious than in the poorer countries. But essentially, basically, what is happening is that if they have a fiduciary responsibility to give you a pension, then they try to give you the pension, and it doesn't. The fact that they have to do this in a more environmentally friendly manner is less accounted for. Okay. And if you look at the companies themselves, most of them are focusing, as I said earlier, on the CEOs and the shareholders. So they're not looking at the social impacts on the rest of the society. This has to be done by government. Government has to be able to dare to set norms of behavior, and not only norms of behavior in terms of pollution, but also provide merit goods, protect. I don't know, do you know what merit goods are? Merit goods are like education and healthcare, but protect the environment so that you don't need to provide so much healthcare. And of course, you have to have tax justice because the whole tax system has gone completely, it's a very awkward system where the super rich avoid taxes everywhere in the world, or they pay very little. So if the government doesn't have the tax revenues, it can't do everything. I mean, I can go in for a long time on this issue of how rich and poor countries have different types of tax revenues, but both are losing out because of loss of profits, a loss of tax revenue from the super rich.
Yes, maybe.
Since we talked about
the issues and why we delay climate action, would you frame the narrative so that we're still
So the problem is with technology development is that I'm coming back to my deregulation story, because what happens is we are encouraging innovation and thinking, like, for example, with respect to AI, but we almost always react afterwards to the development of the technology. But we do have a principle in law, in tort law, like we do talk about the precautionary approach and the no harm approach and liability and accountability. We have all these tools in the legal system that can actually say that if you use that knowledge for harm, for misinformation or disinformation, you should be held accountable. right? We have that knowledge to say to people that if that particular technology is going to cause more problems than less, you should be held accountable. But the problem, of course, is when you take a saw can cut one tree, an electric saw can cut hundreds of trees. So you can really exacerbate technology, deforestation. So with technologies, there has to be always responsibility about how you're using this thing. Now, there was a lot of progress towards content control till very recently. And content control is the content of all these documents that we see. And unfortunately, all that progress has been reversed in the last 4 months. So there is a problem because, and that is also when I was talking about the impact of the super rich to get freedom of speech. If you look at some of the internet and all, they're all governed by, not by the multilateral system. And a lot of people love that because it is their billionaires who are running that system. But if you are in a developing country, it's not your billionaire. So why should you care? So there is a problem with the way in which we govern the new technologies. And I think we have to be very careful about that. And as a scholar, I have to sign all kinds of integrity and ethics documents. And it looks like our politicians don't have to do it, our CEOs don't have to do it, and our technology guys don't have to do it. I once went to a meeting of algorithm makers. It was a conference where I was talking about justice and algorithms. And they looked at me and they said, ethics? But we're just doing formulas. Hello? The formulas are full of ethical questions. And it was a really complicated discussion. I don't know whether it has improved since then. But to me, I think this whole business of, you came back to normative thought. For me, the normative thought about the way we in the university tell us to do ethics and to do integrity, it's unbelievably complicated. It's good that we have it. I'm proud of it. But why is nobody else in society subject to it?
Perhaps the related question with the second one is like one of the kind of was talked about. I don't believe is the emissions of the military funding, and especially
what funding?
Emissions of the military, and especially in today, genocide and conflict increasing. Like, how would that fit into the?
So the thing is with military funding and military emissions, it is, I think, now voluntarily counted. Countries can report and countries may also not report. Given that right now within Europe, we are going up with our emissions, I've seen two opposite storylines. In the Netherlands, I heard on the news, I don't know whether it's actually happening or not, but they said to encourage the growth of the military, we must avoid all those permits, which take a lot of time. So they do a shortcut. And that is a problem for me, because if you do military development, try and do it as green as possible. Then I saw that, I think it was the King of Spain. I think he made a presentation recently where he said that we should be talking about climate and military security all together, because one is a foreign enemy and one is the climate system, and together we must deal with these issues. So for me, I think it's really important that if the military is going to develop further, then they should make sure that it is as circular as possible, that they can get back their mines later, that they know exactly where they put the mines so they don't have to hunt for it, that they can take back, because the mines are again starting, there's now a whole discussion of putting mines on the border of Europe and the other countries, and also to make sure that you're using renewable energy in your systems. And the military has a lot of research, so they can also contribute to this process. It's an elephant in the room, but there is discussion.
I'm interested if you move away from the anthropocentric perspective and human rights. I'm interested and I'm researching about it. I wonder if you think that the introduction of nature rights and maybe ecocide as a crime against humanity will be of any use for the cause basically to meet the boundaries. Will it make any difference if we introduce it like a crime against humanity and we give a right for nature just based on the nature of destruction prevented in the forest, not based on human rights representation?
So if you look at our water boundary, our surface water boundary is that you can use 20% of the water, and 80% of the water at a particular area must go back downstream. So basically, you're trying to make sure that at every location across the river, 80% of the water is for the creatures of the river and the downstream countries. So in some ways, you could see this as an articulation of the right of the river. Similarly, if we were to come up with a notion, and we have tried to do that, 50 to 60% of all land should be given back to nature, and not just in countries with high tropical forest density, but also in countries like ours in the global north, then that could also be seen as the right of the nature. There's a quantification of the rights of the nature. Okay, now the question is, if you go beyond that, the ecocentric approach versus the anthropocentric approach. The problem is trees don't, an indigenous person told me that trees talk to him, but I am not able to hear what trees tell me, right? So I have a feeling that when we talk with nature, we are actually personifying nature. We are trying to listen, and there is a lot of science that can help us with this. So in many ways, and making space for nature is essential for the functioning of the earth. So, we are in the biodiversity crisis, so we really have to make space. So, and then you can use the right of nature for that. But I would want to go one step further and say that when I look at, say, indigenous communities and their discussion about water, they see water as part of their body. They see that they have a good relationship with water. If you go to Islam, Islam sees water as a gift of God. You can't just buy and sell it. It's because God gave it to you. If you go to the ancient Hindu cultures, not now, then you will find that you cannot have property rights to water because you take it and it comes out. You have the right to use. Now, if you have these people who are talking of water like that, and our chemistry department is talking about water as H2O, then there is a problem at the ontological level in our discussion process. So my colleagues and I are working on a paper right now to say, how do we deal with this ontological difference? Because for me, water is a god, but it is also a system, and it's also H2O. So it can have multiple facets. But to come back to ecocide will definitely be part of a constitution, because I think it's really important. And it's not just ecocide, but it's human. There's somebody else who did this. There's someone who wrote a paper on humanicide. It's a murder of also people in other parts of the world. So it's not just the environment.
Yeah, thanks. This was really a fantastic talk. I have a couple of questions, but I will restrict it to one. You made a comment on the link between fossil fuel industry and universities. I remember 2 years ago or so, there was this big discussion at the University of Amsterdam. Should we cut the ties with the fossil fuel industry? And a couple of people were invited to give 5-minute pitches. I gave a pitch and said we should, because revoking the social license to operate and other honest focus. And I just remembered, actually, I don't think you were invited, and I'm wondering whether the executive board was kind of afraid of somebody of your stature, advocating for cutting ties. But maybe I'm misreading your position. So I'm interested in what you think of the link between.
I don't know why I was so invited. It could also be, I don't know, was it in 2023?
Yes, that's right.
So in 2023, I did have a health issue, so I was not always present. But I'm surprised they didn't invite me. But my feeling is we have to cut ties.
Yeah.
And we have to cut ties, whether it's through our pension funds or through the finance. And the papers I read sometimes about other universities, I don't know how dependent we are, but some of the universities are very dependent. And in some countries where it's just fossil fuel that is running the country, everything, even childcare, is financed by fossil fuel. So it's so unbelievably difficult because they did not develop other technologies or other ways of doing things to get off. My personal feeling is that we have to figure out a way to get off fossil fuel. In my personal life, I've tried to get off fossil fuel, but you do take a plane now and then, and you do other things where you have to, and of course, fossil fuel is important in the computer and all the products we buy. But I personally feel that we have to really take a strong stand on this because, and the problem why we don't do it is because they're so unbelievably rich. And that is why we have to take them to court and get the money through the liability to the government so the governments can finance us.
Issue about finance, pension funds. When you and others say reallocate, there is nowhere to reallocate. You, as stranded assets, if you monetize and then you try to buy something green,
there's no way to put the money.
There is no green that covers the fossil fuel economy is 90%. So if you sell 90% of a pension fund asset, you don't have 90% of green. And the European Central Bank structure, those 23 wrote a paper about being aware about green bond. Because if you have disorderly transition, and the pension funds thrive by green, there will be someone that will package something green, like collateral.
You're right.
And that will be classified as the equivalent in the price, A class, A green, instead inside it would be B level, C level, brown inside, but it would be sold as a green. So be aware that there doesn't exist a market.
No, so the problem, so I have two answers to this. The first answer is indeed, at this moment, there is so much money in our pension funds and in our investment funds and our banks. There's just too much money, and they're hunting for something to invest in. And this has led to land grabbing and water grabbing in the global south. It has got left to greenwashing if all the products in the banks. For me, it should be the other way around, because this is because the rich people want to get richer and richer and richer and richer. I think if you were able to tax this, and the investment is not so much on profits, but the investment is, hey, you know, I was able to make sure that these people were able to get healthcare. I was able to make sure that people were able to get education. So my feeling is that the money that we have in all these investments is not coming. It is actually accumulation by dispossession. And that's the term that is used in the scholarship. People become richer by dispossessing people down the chain. If you buy bananas, you're probably paying maybe 10 cents per banana or whatever. The guy who grew it gets nothing practically, because all through the value chain, it is being chains on. So in my view, what's happening is that the companies who then sell you the bananas or the apples or whatever it is, they're the ones who make the money, but not the people who actually grew the stuff. And then those guys are so squeezed, they use all kinds of cheap pesticides. They don't have enough resources. They have to sort of drain the land of its resources. So my story to you is twofold. The first one, there is too much money in our pension funds and banks. And that is a problem. And I think we need to recirculate the money into streetlights or whatever else we need to have. And the second is, you're absolutely right, finding something to invest in. I was giving a lecture to the investors in the Netherlands a few months ago, last year. And then I finished my presentation, and that was the first question. They said to me, okay, can you give us a list of things we should invest in? And I thought, you know, of course you should do renewables, but renewables have to be done sustainably. So if you're doing lithium mining, you have to clean up the water, and you have to make sure that the batteries in the future are different. You have to spend money, and you have to focus on less returns on investment. It's just very capitalist and very focused on, and a lot of these billionaires, they don't do much with that money. You know, what can you do? You can only have one breakfast per day. You know, there's a limit to what you can do. You know, so it's a very strange story that we have all these people with so much money. Sorry, I have to say that.
I think you was also.
Yeah. I want to turn to you know,
It's not about the local that we the whole
carbon.
No.
Yeah. And I'm probably going to misuse two concepts here, but I think they're useful. Yeah, so the concepts are the positive freedoms and negative freedoms. So positive freedoms would be freedom to do something, and negative freedoms would be freedom from something. So I'm wondering how you think about the role of the two different types of freedoms in what once we conceptualize a boundary that we can't get past, and specifically in relation to intergenerational justice, because my sense is that it would reinforce or strengthen negative freedoms, freedom from deprivation, for instance, but at the same time, we would do so at the cost of positive freedoms.
So the question is whether the positive freedom is limited by your footprint. And it may be a carbon footprint, but it could be your total footprint, your footprint on the fish of the earth, or the footprint on pesticides. It will be a total footprint, also based on your investment. So not just your breakfast or your consumption. So if you were to say to everybody that there is, I mean, right now in the Earth Commission, we are working at 3 footprints. One is for the absolute poorest, to help them have the chance to escape from poverty. It's not necessarily that they escape, So it's half the chance, it's very limited. Then we are working for a sort of a footprint for, let's say, most of us in this room, though all of us probably consume too much and produce too much, but a footprint for all of us that we can live relatively happy lives without messing up the earth too much. And then for the super rich, we try to give the upper limit, but it's calculated back from the boundary. So there's not that much space. And so the message then for those people is, hey, you can be as rich as you like, but you can't spend the money, right? And then what happens? And you can't invest the money, because if you invest it in all these problematic things, you have a problem. Of course, this is a fantasy. Huh? These are all thought experiments that we are conducting. So in many ways, what you said, I will use it. The negative freedom, you want to make sure that you have a freedom from being exposed to dirty air, dirty soil. And you want to make sure that you have the freedom to use your resources and your sinks without going beyond your personal boundary. I mean, I don't know. That's the only way I can think of figuring out to answer your question.
When we compare or class the global issues, we mostly trace it based on the carbon emissions that are done in that country.
No, also consumption.
So on that note, do you have carbon taxation even if it's done remotely in other countries?
In fact, right now there is a discussion of what's called the CBAM regulation in Europe. And the idea with that is that Europe will minimize the imports. I'm saying this a little bit colloquially, will minimize the imports of goods and products from other parts of the world that have been made using fossil fuel. I think that's also a challenge unless we ourselves stop using fossil fuel here. But essentially what you're seeing is there's some kind of pressure being put on other countries of the world to reconsider this for consumption purposes. Yep.
Regarding the taxes on the wheat.
Taxes on?
On the wheat,
Yeah.
you mentioned before, how do you visualize that? Would you rather go for a very high tax, like other countries, or would you rather go for a cap on growth and after that you can get anything else on that?
I don't know. We are right now investigating this particular topic. We were very sure that we would like to go back from the cap on pollution or resource use to how you allocate, say, a footprint or something like that to people. And then the impact on your wealth and your income could be different. But on the other hand, what we see is, and one of my MSc students is currently working on it. She's trying to look at how does it work in a society. And it turns out that most people who get a proper, who get a salaried job, like us, like teachers, we all pay quite high amounts of, well, depending where you are, you pay quite a decent amount of taxes. But then suddenly the others, they go down. And that is because we don't want them to leave the country. And so we have all these other systems of creation of wealth that we help these super rich people to create that wealth. So what, and to evade and avoid the law. So right now we're just trying to map how this works and why it is that the super rich pay much less than everybody else in terms of a percentage of their income and a percentage of their wealth. So that's what we're trying to map, and we still have to do some thinking about how to do this. But if you look, take a different story. Let's take, and going back to the investment story that he brought, one of my PhDs told me that if you do a project in Germany, it's 6% interest. You do it in Tanzania, it's 24% interest. So what happens is the countries that are the weakest in terms of being able to pay back get the highest rate of interest, which basically means that with the exchange rate fluctuations, they're not able to pay back. So they go into a spiral of more and more and more debt. And then when they don't pay back, then we charge them more, and it just creates an unbelievably complicated system in our international investment market. And right now you're seeing that there is a lot of money in the banks and everybody wants to invest in water in the global south and they want to invest here and there. I'm in panic because I wonder, if you do that at a high level of interest, how are you going to do the basic things that people need with the water? So this is a challenge, and that's also the way our financial system is being created. And it's both these narratives are a little problematic, and we have to work on both, but I don't yet have the solution to either.
What about the regulation of luxury goods and also carbon intensive, like private goods?
So the question, of course, is in terms of luxury versus fast fashion, let's take. So fast fashion, some of these companies that sell you t-shirts, 10 euros, and all this whole massive waste of old t-shirts and old jeans. That's the fast fashion problem. That's a huge problem. If you go to the luxury end, if they're only wearing that luxury outfit one day in a year, that's a problem. But if they're wearing a luxury item quite often, it's a different problem. But if I go to, for example, a private ship, this is a dangerous topic, but I know that Oxfam wrote a report some time ago, and I think I don't know if I'm correctly citing, but one Australian in 1 hour emits as much emissions in his luxury boat as an average Australian in a whole year. So, you know, those private boats, the private airlines that fly into Davos for the World Economic Forum, maybe that's where we draw the line. But if somebody is wearing a very beautifully embroidered outfit that can be worn many, many times, I may not draw the line there because that embroidery has been done by a lot of hand labor and stuff. I don't know. But I mean, I'm just comparing two different types of storylines. And yeah, it's really complicated about where you draw the line on luxury goods and what is allowed, what's not allowed, and how do we reduce. And to be honest with all of you, when I started research, I was working on the Throwaway Society. I was working on, that's in 1990. The book never came out, alas. But anyway, these things happen. Failure is part of life. And that book was called Toxic Terrorism. And it was about how our garbage was going to other parts of the world. So in the deep down in my heart, I've always known that there's a problem. But in the last 3 years, the knowledge I have acquired on these issues has been much, much more frightening, because it's not just in, somewhere in a remote spot that there is deforestation. It's just everybody. None of us comes with clean hands to the table. So it's something that we have to think a lot about, whether we are doing fast fashion, fast shoes, slow fashion, slow cooking. Slow cooking uses more energy. But if you go to a fast food joint, maybe it's coming from somewhere else. Yes.
Yeah, maybe Tabea has one last question, and then.
Yeah, so you're saying tax the rich, I'm totally with you on that. But then I see myself increasingly living under governments that don't do anything with that money that I would like to see, that don't do anything with that money to power. So I wonder what you're supposed to do about that, and what we can expect when that's it feels like we're in a lock-in.
Some time ago, I went to a conference where they were saying that in most rich countries, and again, I'm citing from memory, so I might be slightly wrong, about 20% of your GDP becomes the income of the government, and then they do your street lights and they do all kinds of activities within the country, including accountability of the various actors in the government. So they can't just spend the money without demonstrating how they spend the money. In the developing world, it was sometimes between 2% and 10%, which meant that these governments had very little money, which meant that they gave the street lights only to rich neighborhoods or to the neighborhoods that created a problem. And I remember when I was young and I was in a ladies' hostel, we never got water. But the boys' hostel got water because they would throw stones and destroy the property, and we didn't. So we never got water in that hostel. I mean, we got very little water in the hostel. So essentially, then you have this power struggle when the government has so little money that they don't have enough money for resources. Plus, they don't have the money to create the accountability systems that you need in a democracy. I think, and that's why also I'm working on the Global Constitution Project, it is time to reinvent democracy. And in reinventing democracy, there has to be some kind of a narrative about how unequal can a society be for a functioning democracy. How we need to educate people in this science age, okay? Because we are in the age of science. And if you don't know how the science is misusing you or using you or what the results are, you can't function. That was my initial narrative, that there is an intergenerational gap right now with the elder people in a society. Not everybody, but some. So I think that that part of the constant education of the public is such an important part, and it has to be done through the government. And the other thing is to create that sense of can you run for elections? Under what conditions can you run for elections? You know, what is your ethical and integrity statement? How can we hold you accountable on ethics and integrity and content control in relation to what you're spreading on your storyline? So we have to come back, I think, to a much more ethical human rights, ecocide. These are some of the principles we have to have in that system to create better democracies. Because if we don't do that, then what will happen is that misinformation and disinformation, which is the #1 threat to world security today, according to the World Economic Forum, will overtake our societies. And most people will get confused by that information they're getting. Vaccines are not good, COVID vaccine is causing problems, all that sort of stuff. And then they will vote in governments that are not necessarily responsible. And we are seeing that not just we are seeing that also in the Netherlands. So my gut feeling is it's almost 100 years since 1945, and we had the UN Charter, and it's time now for us to revisit the entire system. And I agree with a lot of the degrowth theories and the post-growth theories, but my narrative is if the space we are giving to world is so large, we need to reduce that space, shrink it down based on the boundaries and the standards and equality, and make certain rules about how we deal with each other.